Thank you so much for spending your Thursday night with us. I know it's a beautiful day and you've all decided to be inside, so thank you. I appreciate that. My name's Mallory Aarons. I'm the head of adult programming here at Darien Library, and it's my great honor to welcome you here inside our community room. Programs at the library are made possible by our annual contributions to the Friends of the Library campaign. We get to do great things like bring fabulous authors here to Darien because of your contributions, so thank you for making all of these possible. I'd also like to thank Sally and everyone at Barrett Bookstore for helping us out tonight. They are very much our partners in crimes in terms of everything literary and book here in Darien, so thank you, Sally. I'd also like to thank the Middlesex Genealogical Society. They helped us put on tonight's event, and I hope we all leave inspired with local history and genealogical research, and you'll give them a call because they are very, very really our local experts here in Darien. Now, for tonight's guest. He was the founding editor of the revered Gray's Sporting Journal, where he discovered some people you may have heard of. The early fiction of E. Annie Proulx, Rick Bass, and many others who have gone on to distinguished writing careers. He subsequently founded Gray Books Publishers and Isle Seat Books, and he's the author of a dozen books of essays and other writings. Please join me in welcoming to the library Ed Gray.
Thank you, Mallory. That was wonderful. And thanks to everyone involved in dragging me down here from New Hampshire. I owe you an especially complicated thank you because you allowed me to reintroduce myself to the wonders of driving down here in the Bermuda Rectangle. Anyway, I got here on time. I'm happy to be here, and I'm glad to see so many people. Thank you so much for coming out on such I think, a really beautiful night. We'll see if we can keep it that way. This is the book we're going to talk about, Left in the Wind. It's brand new. Came out on the 3rd of this month. And this is my first meeting with people like you to talk about it. So that's both the good and the bad news. I have not really run through this thing as many times as I ought to have, and I may end up reading, and I might even get some of the slides out of order, but we'll try, and thank you for putting up with it. I'm going to start by presenting you with a problem, a theoretical one. Suppose you lived someplace that was near a very dangerous place, a place that because you lived near it, you knew it well. You knew how dangerous it was. You knew that anybody who went into that place wasn't going to come back out. Any group that went in there was probably all going to die. So while you're near that place one day, you get approached by a group of people, and they have a leader. And that leader says to you that he's taking this group to that place. He says it's the land of milk and honey, it's Shangri-La, it is a perfect place, maybe just a wonderful valley in which they could form a community and start growing crops. He has convinced all of these people, men, women, and children, that once they get there, their lives will be better than they could have imagined. And you know every word of that is wrong. It's probably a lie, but it's certainly wrong. So you do your best to convince this leader and the people following him not to go there. They just can't. You just can't make an argument strong enough, and they don't listen. The leader goes to his people and says, this person who lives here is deluded. This person is wrong. This place is heaven. So the people take a vote, and they decide to follow their leader. In the morning, they're going to go. And they're going to die. What do you do? That's the problem that Emme Merrimoth faces in the book I just wrote. Probably didn't have that in it, but in fact, that's just one of her problems. So, I got loud all of a sudden. With that in mind, why did I get so loud? Is that too loud? Okay, maybe better. Tonight I'm going to tell you a little bit about how Emme got into that quandary, and I'm going to tell you about that by showing you how I discovered Emme and the place that she lived. So, first off, let's think about Roanoke Island. You know, where is that place? Maybe I can turn my backwards. I'll get it right after this one. Okay. Let's go to Roanoke. It's actually in what's now North Carolina, in Pamlico Sound. It's that island that you see right there. If I can turn my brother's pointer on. This is Roanoke Island. This is Virginia Beach and Newport News. And right up around the corner up here is where the Jamestown colony eventually got started and stayed. That was 20 years after this colony was established and failed in Roanoke. That was 1587. So on Roanoke, you can actually drive to it now. There's a causeway, and it's a National Historic Site called Fort Raleigh, which is what the colonists named their place. It's had about 17 million people go there since the National Historic Site was completed. And I guess you're probably wondering about that outdoor drama. I certainly was, so I looked into it. It's been going since 1937. It's the oldest running outdoor drama in the United States. It sees several 100,000 people go to it every year, and it's a musical. It has its own theater that is constructed on the island only to show this show and maybe a few other shows they show to fill the theater during the off weekends. Here's what, because they've been attracting this crowd for so long, they have a really good summary of what the Croatoan Island really was. So I'm going to just read it to you. This is what they say on their website. In July of 1587, 117 English men, women, and children came ashore on Roanoke Island with a commission from Elizabeth I to establish a permanent English settlement in the New World. Just 3 years later, in 1590, when English ships returned to bring supplies to the settlement, they found the island deserted with no sign of the colonists except the single word Croatoan, carved into the surface of an abandoned structure, and the letters C-R-O scratched into the bark of a tree. After nearly 450 years, the mystery of what happened to the colonists remains unsolved. Let's start there. That's pretty much where I started. That's about what I knew when I decided it was time to think about writing a book. This is pretty much the summary. 117 men, women, and children started a colony. Actually, the first English child born in North America, Virginia Dare, granddaughter of the colony's founder, was born while he was still there. He was only there a few weeks. The founder then went back to England, and when he came back 3 years later, they were gone. No European ever saw any of them again. Well, what happened to him, of course, is anyone's guess. And people have really been guessing. The Fort Raleigh National Historic Site has got a bunch of researchers who work there, and they have carefully cataloged all of the books and pamphlets and broadsides that have ever been written about it, and they're quite opinionated about what they think about these books. So I actually read all of their little summaries and decided which ones I should read in order to try to figure this thing out. I'm going to read you a couple of their summaries to give you an indication of what the literature has been like over the years. Here's a few that I found. In 1840, somebody wrote a book called Virginia Dare, and this is what they said. The first in a long list of published treatments of the Virginia Dare myth. Here, Virginia marries a wandering Jamestown settler. Then in 1908, a novel came out that made Virginia the mother of Pocahontas. In 1930, another novel came out that included Virginia, Pocahontas, and John Smith in a romantic triangle. In 1953, one William Strachey, he took it over the top, and he had the survivors of the lost colony capturing apes in the mountains of North Carolina. This is the summary from the researchers at this National Historical Site. In a niche all their own lie a few strange works, discursive in appearance, fictional in content and effect, and influential out of all proportion to their worth. Most are based on dyslexia, wishful thinking, bowdlerization of the historical record, or plain attempts to fabricate a new, more tractable record. I think I'm guilty of that last one. Let's take a look at that. So I decided the books weren't going to get me where I needed to get to. So I decided, let's go back and take a look at that play. And it is a symphonic drama. Okay, not bad, but a little stiff. You know, maybe something a little more modern, a little more edge to it. I found, no. Maybe dial it back just a little bit. Well, actually, I might play that video game, but it's not that. I mean, they got it wrong. It isn't Jamestown anyway, so I suppose it is. Maybe I thought, oh, let's take another look at the musical. No. So I thought, okay, I'm not getting very far with the published works of art. Let's go with some visual art. Most of the visual art that I found, and there's quite a lot of it, is in this vein. Very formal. There's Virginia Dare being baptized by some really well-dressed colonists who are actually in real life starving to death and barely able to keep themselves clothed, but nonetheless. So I thought, I'll look a little further. No. Actually, maybe if I really wanted to sell a lot of books, I would have stuck with that model, but I did not. Okay, I went back to the books. And finally, I found two terrific ones, just fabulous. I probably should have found them first. David Quinn's Set Fair for Roanoke is the absolute most authoritative version of all of the Roanoke voyages. He died just a few years ago. He was the expert for decades on the topic, and he wrote everything. Anybody who wants to know anything about any of those English voyages prior to Jamestown needs to read David Quinn. And the other book, Milton's Big Chief Elizabeth, is a super accessible, it's basically the same thing, but he tells it like a story, and it's a great book. If you don't read anything else other than my book, of course, then definitely read this one. Between the two of them, you'll know all of the accepted history of what happened there. And that's what I did. But then I decided I really need to go to the original sources. Each of the leaders of the various voyages to the New World in those late 1500s wrote journals when they went back. It was sort of required. The British are excellent at keeping that stuff. They kept them. They're essentially still in print. So I found the journals of John White, who was the governor who put together this colony, who went there, whose granddaughter was Virginia Dare, who then went back to England for resupply, and who came back in 1590 and found them gone. History records him as one of the truly sad characters of the world. So I read his journal. And it didn't take me long to discover that this guy, John White, did not suffer from lack of ego. His accounts were pretty much all about himself, with some carping asides about his chief rival, the navigator named Simon Fernandez. And then I got to his detailed description, and most of his descriptions aren't. They're just quick paintbrush stuff, but he got to this long description. It read like a legal defense of this document that he took back to England with him when he went back after when the colonists were starving in that first 1587. And the document was signed by every adult member of that 117-person colony. And in it, in very formal language, they begged him and treated him against his wishes to please, please, please go back to England and get us some supplies. We know you don't want to do it, but we're begging you to do it anyway. And they all signed it. They didn't just put their names on it, they signed it. Well, the good news is that's how we know the names of everybody who was in the colony, because they actually listed. We know whether they were male or female, whether they were married or single, whether they were a child or not. And it was because of this document. But I got to thinking about that document, and I said to myself, why did the leader of this colony, whose people are starving to death, undersupplied, and in danger of all dying, why did he need a written document from them begging him to go back and save them? It made no sense to me. And I said to myself, I know why somebody does something like that. It's to cover something up. He was hiding something. Well, then his next journal is 3 years later, when he finally comes back. Now, his story, as he records it there, and other historians have accepted, is that when he got back to England, he tried to put together some ships to bring the resupply back, but the Spanish Armada was becoming a serious threat to England, and Elizabeth said no ships can do anything other than stay here and defend us against the Armada. It took him 3 years to get 3 ships, and then he went back. When he went back to the colony, he went to Roanoke, and they found the fort that the people had made. It was all knocked down. There was nobody there. There was one skeleton. They didn't know whether it was a Native American or an Englishman. They couldn't tell, so they buried it with English rights anyway, and they could find nothing else. So, except for that tree that said Croatoan. So, it was obvious what he had to do. He knew what Croatoan was. Croatoan was the next island down from the Outer Bank Island that protected Roanoke. It's what's now known as Hatteras Island. And on Croatoan was a very friendly Indian tribe, a village that was well known not only to John White, but everybody on that returning ship. So they knew exactly where these colonists had gone. It was actually a signal that they had prearranged that if the colonists packed up and left, they would carve in the tree the name of the place they went to, knowing that the Native Americans couldn't read it. And if they left under duress, they would carve a Maltese cross in there with it. But there was no Maltese cross. So history says, and John White apparently concluded, as he says in his own journal, that he was going to go to Croatoan and find his colony. They got back in their ships, they sailed out to go down there. It's a couple of days sail south, and a big storm came up. They had no way of predicting hurricanes. It was pretty much always hurricane season by the time they got to the New World. So they had to go offshore to avoid being blown onto the beach, and when they came back, they didn't go to Croatoan. They didn't do it. They just left. His explanation is that he really didn't have complete control of these ships, that these other masters were tired and wanted to go maybe raid the Spanish and take some privateer money. Again, it just read like the thinnest of possible excuses. Can you imagine it? These were his people. This was his own granddaughter. This was his daughter. He knew where they were, and he didn't go there. So I decided, this guy is lying. This guy is not the man that history records, this sad figure who couldn't find his colony and died in England a few years later. So, the good news for me is now I've got a book. Because what every book needs is a villain, and I have a villain. So then I said, oh, okay, who's my hero? Well, I was pretty much in the dark. At this point, I had a blank. And although I knew the names of all the people, there was no history. There was nothing. I mean, there was just a little bit of stuff about what they had done back in England, but not many of them. Most of them were just names on a parchment. Absolutely blank. You know, there was no personal histories. If they were extinguished. There were no memoirs written. And then I said, oh, how do you know there was no memoirs written? There just aren't any now. If somebody wrote one, maybe it just disappeared. So then I said, oh, I now have got a form for my book. I'm almost there. Now I have to decide who wrote it. There she is. You can see her down at the bottom. This is a list of all the participants. Emme Merrimoth, 1587. So I did a lot of research. I tried to find Emme Merrimoth. Nope. There was nothing in any of the deeply researched stuff you can get in England. Nobody knew who she was. So what I learned is that some of the people were what they call assistants. There were 13 of them and their wives, and they were the second rank of command below John White on this colony. Some of them, people were tradesmen, but a lot of the unattached women, and Emme was unattached, were maidservants, housemaids, something or other. All I knew about Emme was that she wasn't a child and she wasn't attached. And I said, got it. Because I don't want my main protagonist to be one of the principals. You know, everybody does that. And the principals always have got baggage. They've got decisions they made that got recorded. I want somebody who wasn't in position to make any decisions, but who was going to really watch, see, and not be able to escape what happened. So, Emme Merrimoth. The rest, as they say, is fiction. So, I am now, with some trepidation, going to read a portion of this book. When I first thought about making this appearance and talking in front of you all tonight, of course, it's often referred to as a reading. I know you have to read something from your book, but the voice in my book, and it's all the first person, is a 25-year-old English female 16th century woman. You don't want to hear me try to do that one. On the other hand, her voice, take it from me, because it started appearing to me as I wrote it, is really strong. It's really distinctive. She is a fascinating person. I'm only going to read a tiny bit of Emme tonight, but the whole thing really is. And I'll give you one more little tidbit. When the book was bought by Pegasus Books in New York, Claiborne Hancock, the wonderful publisher and editor-in-chief, assigned a brand new editor to the project. It was the first book she has ever edited. She's been an editorial assistant and had jobs before that. She's 23 years old. Oh my goodness. So, and she read every word and every thought and every deed of my 25-year-old heroine. That was a wonderful thing. Katie McGuire steered this book in a way that I think gives it more voice than it had, and I thought it had a lot of voice. So anyway, I just wanted to say that. So what I'm going to read for you now is the short preface at the beginning of the book. I assume when you pick up this book that you know not even what we just discussed about the history. I assume that you might have heard of the Lost Colony, you might have heard of Roanoke, you might think it's a city in Virginia in the mountains. It's not. It's an island in North Carolina, as we've seen. So this is what I wrote, and I think it sets the stage pretty well for what happens when the book starts. The journal you are about to read is a work of fiction. It does not exist even in the imagined form you find here. On its last page, you will discover why. But first you should know some history. Emme Merrimoth was an actual person, as were the other 90 men, 16 women, and 11 children of the Lost Colony, left on what is now Roanoke Island, North Carolina, in 1587 and never heard from again. Their names are part of recorded history, but little else is known of them. They were left behind by their leader, Governor John White, who sailed back to England with several of his assistants and did not return for 3 years. When he did, the colonists had vanished, leaving behind the ruin of their fortified compound, the letters C-R-O carved into a tree, and the word Croatoan carved into one of the posts of the palisade. Croatoan was the name, well known to White and his returning crew, of what is now Hatteras Island, a short sail to the south. But White and his crew did not go to Croatoan after reading its name carved in the ruins of Roanoke by the very people they had come looking for. Instead, they sailed away, heading toward Hispaniola and then England, passing within sight of Croatoan, but not stopping to see if the English colonists were there. Why? No one knows. The answer, like the colony itself, is lost to history. When White sailed away from his still vibrant colony that first time, he carried with him a document signed by each of the adults he left behind, entreating him to return to England in spite of his own desire to stay at Roanoke in order to secure relief supplies for the struggling colony. That document, along with other records kept in England, is how we know the names of all the lost colonists, including White's own granddaughter, Virginia Dare, born to his daughter Eleanor and her husband Ananias Dare just 9 days before White left the New World. White finally returned in 1590 with 3 small ships that he did not command. On August 12th, the ships anchored for 1 night off Croatoan. The next day, they sailed north for Roanoke and arrived 3 days later. There, they saw smoke rising. Assuming they would find the colony still intact, White and several others went ashore, but found only the abandoned colony, those mysterious carved letters, and the remains of White's own chest of belongings, including his maps and drawings, strewn about and ruined. After searching Roanoke for several days, the group decided to sail back to Croatoan. A storm arose, driving them offshore to deeper, safer water. But when the storm abated, they didn't sail back to Croatoan. They simply left. The captains of the 3 ships chose to leave for the West Indies and then cross back to England. John White died in England 3 years later, and no European ever saw any of the lost colonists again. We know all of this because White kept a journal. It tells his own version of the story, the only version known to history. Which brings us to this, the Roanoke Journal of Emme Merrimoth. Read it for what it is, fiction, a speculation, an imagination of how one colonist, Emme Merrimoth, might have recorded her own version of the story and what she then did with the journal after she watched from Croatoan as the English ships sailed away, taking her last hope with them. This is her story, but it's also a question. If a story gets told and no one hears it, is it still a story? So let's go with Emme. Let's go back to Roanoke, flipping it on its side the way the English map makers did. This is, you can see how this is, west is north. And then I've overlaid this. This is the current Google Earth with John White's map of the same place. This is Emmys World. This is what she found along with the other 116 colonists. You can see Croatoan in there. That's right here, that's this big long island. They came through this cut at Trinity Harbor. They put ashore at Roanoke, and they set up their colony. Surrounding them were the very friendly Indians at Croatoan, some very, very hostile Indians in Quepuic. They even put an Indian there, put some friendly family Indians over here. And in this map of John White's, you can actually see, this is Chesapeake Bay, and this point right here is where Jamestown was settled 20 years later successfully. In Emmy's travels in this book, she will be at various times and under various threats and problems. She will cover most of this land. She will end up here on the beach of Croatoan watching the ships sail away. So let's take a look at Emmys World. It was a really vibrant civilization. These are John White's paintings. They're in the British Museum, carefully preserved, and available for anybody who wants to go and download them. The other ones just across the water, they would be very paternalistic, and one of them would be ruled by a king who was as despotic or not as any king in England. It was a very, very vibrant civilization that got recorded by John White and some of the other people who recorded. They recorded their language. They wrote in great detail of the Native Americans by name, and so there's just a huge amount. So in my book, every single character, both English and Native American, is an actual character who lived at the time and is recorded in one way or another in one of these journals. This is how they dressed. Mostly they didn't dress. And that's another feature, but they painted themselves. It wasn't really a tattoo. It was a form of body painting. We don't really know because they just describe it, but not in enough detail to know, for us to know what made it. But they had some really, really odd.
Your mic went dead. So.
I did? Killed my mic, huh? Okay. They had some very strange customs, and this one was some sort of a dance, obviously, but they interacted nonstop on a daily basis with the English, and basically they were dressed like this, and the English were dressed like you can imagine they were. And how they figured that out is, well, they figured it out. This is Emmys World. So I'm not going to, I could show you pictures for hours. You know, there are really so many of these wonderful pictures. So when you're trying to create a person who's living in this time and in that place, for me, I would rather look at art and maps than read the accounts. The accounts are written in stilted Old English. They're clearly self-serving, they're formal, and they don't tell you anything the way a modern account would about the actual daily lives of the people who were living other than in the best house in the colony. So I spent several years actually just taking in all of these images that I could find and reading the things. And then when I thought I knew who Emme was, and when I thought I had her voice, I wrote the very last page of the book. The very, very last page. And when I wrote it, and then I tweaked it, and I played with it, and I got it exactly where I wanted it to be. And then I said, okay, how do I get her there? That took another 2 years. But eventually I did. And in that 2 years, I started writing Emmy's journal for her. And like I think many fiction writers will tell you, at some point, your principal character comes alive and starts doing and saying things from where you have no idea they came. That person is truly alive in your head. And that's what happened with Emmy and me. And you know, there's always, it's one of the reasons you sort of keep something alive for a sequel, because you don't really want to knock off somebody that you've spent so much time with. But so anyway, I'm not going to let you see that last page until you read the book. But I will start with the first page of Emmy's journal. Tonight, Richard Tompkins has been trying to play his fiddle. More and more he has been doing this, always at night, going alone down the beach to solace himself with unrecognizable music that none of the rest of us can avoid, not even the Indians in their darkened villages across the bay. He never was very good at it, and now he seems to be getting worse, making up tuneless sequences of the only notes he knows. But none among us wants him to stop, for the strange new fiddle is the only instrument any of us brought here to the New World, and his playing of it does at least silence the faraway whoops and wails of the natives. Our men say the shouts come from Wanchese's men, girding for another attack on us, but we English women think we know better. We think it comes from their women, lamenting so much of what has happened so far, fearing what might happen next. How long have we been here? I no longer know precisely. Others still watch and mark their calendars, but I am not among them. It is late spring, May, or possibly June. That much is plain without having to mark off the accumulation of days that have passed since we came here. And if it is June, then more than a year will have passed since we left our homes and came to the island of Roanoke in this new world, or, as we have all learned by now, to this very old one. It is a world not very different at all from the one we thought we had left forever behind us as we sailed away from Plymouth, each of us looking backward at the Isle of Wight, slipping slowly below the horizon, taking with it all we knew of civilization, its comforting rewards, the blinding falsity of its promises. None of that matters now. None of it has since the day we were left here, abandoned by the very men who had convinced us to come. What story they told upon their return to England at the end of their despicable flight, none of us expects ever to know. But it could only have been a lie. For it was upon an even bigger falsehood that John White lured us here in the first place. What sort of a man could have done such a thing to his fellow countrymen, to their wives and their children, to his own daughter, and to her daughter, his own newborn granddaughter, born in this new world while he was still with us, while he could hold the infant in his own arms? Even among the savages who have finally turned against us, I have not seen such low character, such a base capitulation to fear and selfishness. Though the governor and his dismal accomplices have left us here to live or die on our own, without even the barest of necessities, and surrounded by increasingly hostile Indians, we are, in my opinion, well rid of him, and those who fled with him. But I always have been an optimist. I had meant to keep a journal. Truly, it had been my firm intention from the very beginning, starting in November of 1586 on the English calendar, by which some of the others still keep track of the days, when John White and his son-in-law Ananias had come by carriage from London to Chelmsford, seeking recruits for their new colony in Sir Walter Raleigh's Virginia. But I haven't kept the journal. I haven't even started it. That I have had distractions. That from the beginning of the voyage itself, I have found myself more an active participant than the passive observer I expected to be, is no longer important. That voyage is, like so much else now, long gone and far behind. What needs to be done now is the telling of the story, of who we are, of what has become of us, and why. And so I have finally begun that journal, recorded here on the few sheaves of paper I hid from the assistants when they came to take my baby, and penned with some of the red dye left here by Wanchese and his painted men when they came after that. What's fascinating to me is why there isn't more good literature written about the Roanoke colony. I don't really know why. There's lots of literature about Jamestown. You know, I mean, I don't know if any of you have tried to read Argall, but good Lord, nobody has time for that. Certainly, there's tons about Plymouth, all the other English colonies, but here's this great, wonderful mystery about which we know something. Enough to know about the characters. Still can't hear me?
We're working on it.
Is that better? I just don't know why there isn't more good literature. I mean, all I wanted to do when I started looking for these books was to find it. I just wanted to read it. And I couldn't find it. So I wrote it. Maybe that sounds out of place, but that's literally what I did. So I will say that at the end of it, Emme is still alive, obviously. She had to write the journal right to the very last word of it. But then she does something truly extraordinary with it. And I'm gonna let you find that. But it does allow for a further continuation of the story. I don't know whether I'll write it or whether anybody will want me to write it, but it is a possibility.
You made the point that John Smith was not in charge of the vessels that came on the relief mission, and yet you condemn him for not controlling his fleet. And the transaction he would have done with them was no doubt based on commerce, and they have their known priorities. They did make one call, which is probably the best he could have negotiated, and I am hurt that you take such offense to him.
And lots of people will be. And my answer to that is what you just described is what John White described. He says he had no control over those men. He says they took him there. He says they decided to do this. He says it was the best possible argument he could make in order to make some sort of a landfall.
What do you say to that? It sounds reasonable.
It sounds like
What sounds completely unreasonable to me is that they did not go to Croatoan. I can't imagine a circumstance under which they wouldn't at least set foot on that island, having come all the way, having seen it, having been on the other island, having seen the sign that he asked his people to leave. Why didn't he go back there?
Was there any subsequent, in the research you did, any subsequent discussion with either the friendly Indians or the unfriendly Indians that would indicate that there were any settlers that had wound up?
No, essentially, no. When Jamestown got founded, they certainly did. They knew the story, and they did ask, and they heard conflicting tales from the Native Americans. But by then, the Native Americans weren't nearly as friendly to the English as they had been when the Roanoke colony arrived and the two previous expeditions, prior to that arrived. So, and then on top of that, as we all know, the English brought smallpox with them. So that vibrant civilization that you saw John White's drawings of basically vanished. They all died. So it's a really fascinating hypothesis. Some people think that the colony went off and maybe with one tribe, maybe with various, and assimilated into it. And of course, they would have all been immune to smallpox, the English. So had they assimilated into these other tribes or other villages or other peoples, what would have happened to them then? That's a really interesting thing to think about. They didn't have the skills to survive, the way the Indians could inland. But there's just a million hypotheses. Every now and again, there was this thing that surfaced in the early part of the 1900s called the Dare Stone. You've probably seen it on some of these TV shows, but it was a stone that had some carvings in it. It was supposedly carved by Virginia Dare herself, saying that she survived and she was with the Indians. And it caused a great stir And it was a really excellent forgery, but it was eventually, once carbon dating got strong enough to disprove it, it was disproven. So nobody really, there's a lot of speculation about what happened, but absolutely nobody knows. David Quinn, the great expert on it, he came to believe the theory that they were all wiped out by a band of Indians who now live in, who lived then in what is now Norfolk. That they got, his explanation that he buys into, as do many other leading experts, is that the colonists were, they may have assimilated into Croatoan, but those people weren't strong enough to withstand a warring attack from this very strong band up in what is now Norfolk. So, and they did, the people in Jamestown did hear that, but.
You would think if it was a warring attack, there'd been more skeletons around than one.
It's interesting because the problem with that, and there is some archaeology going down, some new archaeology that's up one of those rivers we saw, that there have been so many hurricanes in the 450 years that the land itself has shifted completely. So, you know, that's why that map of John White's, as good a cartographer as he was, doesn't match the current Google Earth. Because, I mean, the whole Outer Banks have moved many miles at this point. So there is no chance of finding any of that stuff.
How much of time was there between the Roanoke, colony being founded and then Jamestown?
20 years.
20.
Yeah, my people landed in 1587, Roanoke was 1607. So had there been surviving colonists and had they been assimilated, you know, the Jamestown people certainly expected to find some of them. It was only 20 years. They didn't.
We have time for 2 more questions.
You mentioned that someone had approached this group of people to try to make a colony in the New World. But were they supported by any other, like the East India Company or any other?
No, it was all Elizabeth's. You know, I mean, the English wanted to establish colonies in the northern part of North America because the Spanish were already so strong in Florida. St. Augustine had been there for a long time, and it was well garrisoned, and there were lots of Spanish soldiers there and the ability to move them around. So the people that came over in a couple of the colonies before this and in the Roanoke colony were deathly afraid of being spotted by the Spanish because they knew they would be wiped out immediately. So that was a great problem. That's why they wanted to go up into Chesapeake Bay, to just get farther away. Betsy.
As a Roanoke, Virginia native, and your sister-in-law,
I am in big trouble now.
I grew up knowing all about this because that's what you do when you're Virginian, and I'm descended from Pocahontas, as is almost everybody who is born and raised in Virginia. And we all learned about the lost colony in Roanoke, but it was not named out of our beautiful city, Roanoke, Virginia. So we had a lot of literature in our little world of Virginia. I mean, we knew about Virginia Dare, we knew about the lost colony, we knew about John White, Raleigh, and then I let it go for like 60 years or something. So I just want to highly recommend Ed's book. I loved it. It's a good story of a woman that you get involved with. You just know her and her trials and tribulations in this lost colony, and I just highly recommend it.
That's a great question.
No, nobody who does these things should do it without a plant.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I always wanted to write, and I thought it was what I was going to do. And I was at Dartmouth College as an undergraduate in the 60s, and there was a professor of creative writing there, a guy whose name I blocked out of my mind, but he was late in his career, and he was renowned for having given Bud Schulberg a C+. So, but he ran the only creative writing seminar that was available to college at the time, and so I talked my way into the course, and for an entire semester, each of us in the course just ran stuff we wrote by this guy, and he hated it all. He told me, you can't write, you can't do anything, and finally, the very last piece I submitted to him at the end of the course, he read it, he read the first sentence, and he put the paper down, turned to me, and he said, you finally wrote one good sentence. So so I decided after that maybe I wasn't going to be a writer. So, it was hard, and I got a C+ too, but I figured, okay, I'm up there with Bud Schulberg. But so I sort of set it aside for a bunch of years. I went to tech school and got an MBA. I worked in a bunch of different businesses, sort of what we now call tech startups. And I ended up at Sale magazine, working for a guy named Bernie Goldhirsch, who was just a publishing genius. And I was his comptroller, his financial guy, but there were only 8 of us in the office. And I learned everything I thought you could learn about the magazine business. So I went to Bernie after a couple of years and I said, hey, I want to start my own. He said, sure, go ahead. And I was one of, I think, 4 people who worked for Bernie over the course of the years. So each of us went off and started our own magazines. I started, along with Becky, my wife, started Gray's Sporting Journal.
Sure.
And so we did that, and we got it started. We raised some money, and I told Becky, who had a degree in journalism from BU and really could write, I said, you know, Becky, I want to write a little 2-page column in the front. You know, I'll leave the rest and I'll edit the rest. And she said, oh, sure. And you know, the way she said, she just kind of patted me on the head and said, yeah, you can put anything you want. You're the founder. So I did, and the first one turned out really well. People liked it, and I loved writing it, and I found my voice just doing that.
Yeah.
So 7 times a year, I got to write a couple of pages of whatever I wanted. Sometimes it was fiction, sometimes it was essay, sometimes it was, yeah, I would insert some fiction in there. And then one time we were changing apartments, and Becky came to me and said, look, you don't have to pack boxes. You know, in fact, do me a favor, don't pack boxes. Stay in the office over the weekend and write a full-length fiction piece for the magazine. So I did. I wrote it under a pseudonym, and it was called The Goose Place, and I think it was called The Goose Place. Anyway, but I wrote it under a pseudonym of Lawrence Dracut, which I'd already picked. Lawrence Dracut is a interstate highway sign over Interstate 93 South going into Boston, talking about the 2 towns you could go to there, Lawrence Dracut. So that was my piece, Lawrence, and that was quite a big hit. People guessed for years. They wondered who had written it. I didn't make too much of a secret of it. So now, at that point, I was inoculated with the bug, and now I had to start writing, and I've been pretty much writing nonstop ever since.
Wow. How many books of fiction have you read?
This is my second published book of fiction. It's the first full-length novel. The previous one was a novella called The Old Amulet, and it's a fable, really. It takes place in Alaska. A woman and her children are taking the ashes of the woman's mother to a lake to be buried there, and it's a fable, and that's been published about 7 or 8 years. I've got, like anybody, I've got a bunch of unpublished stuff.
Sure.
Screenplays, other novels, but this is the first one.
Now, tonight you're talking about a book you wrote about the lost colony, yes?
Yes.
Is that fiction or is that?
Oh, it's fiction.
It is fiction.
No, it's a fictional journal
Oh,
of one of the colonists who was left there and disappeared.
what a great idea.
I was really drawn to it, and that's what I'm going to talk about in some depth tonight. But it was just the idea that there was this vibrant Native American civilization that met these really vibrant colonists, 117 men, women, and children, all English, who were deposited there by their governor, the guy who took them there, a guy named John White, who had been there before and was a great artist and a map maker, and his paintings and maps survive today. So, but the quick short version of the story is that they got there too late to really plant. They got in a lot of trouble. They were short supplied and were maybe going to starve to death. Some of the Indians were very friendly, some were very hostile. And John White went back to England to get resupplied. But he didn't get back to the colony for 3 years. Now, the historical explanation, and his, because he wrote contemporaneous accounts, was that when he got back, he couldn't get the ships to get back to the New World because the Spanish Armada was being formed, and Elizabeth said, every ship is here to defend the homeland. So 3 years later, he came back with 3 ships. They went to Roanoke Island, where the colony had been formed. They found the fort all razed down, and carved into one of the posts was this word Croatoan, C-R-O-T-O-A-N, which was the name of an island. It's now Hatteras Island. It's what they called the island back then, well known to John White. And he had left this instruction that if they went somewhere, they would have carved the name, because the natives couldn't read it, to say where they went. So he knew where they went, and that was the island that was inhabited and controlled by very friendly Native Americans. So he, after searching the island, he didn't find the people. He got back in the ships. They started toward Croatoan, and this is according to his journal, a storm came up, so they had to go offshore in order to avoid being pushed onto the beach. And when the storm abated, they didn't go there. They just went to the West Indies looking for some prize ships and went back to England. And so no one ever saw, no European certainly ever saw any of those 117 people again. There was never any evidence of what happened. It's a continuing mystery 450 years later. Well, what an ideal setting for a work of fiction. So I decided, okay, I'm gonna have one of the colonists write a journal of what happened on the way over while John White was there, and what happened after that.
I'm not gonna ask you to get to the conclusion, but obviously you have one.
I have such a conclusion. Although I left it a little bit open-ended, but I will say this. I wrote the very last page of this book first. I wrote it 3 years before I finished the book. I was so happy with this ending, I then had to contrive an entire set of circumstances that would make it as dramatic as it was in my own mind. So, and that's basically the really backwards method by which I created this novel.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's a great story. It's been a great, well, I don't think there's ever been a film about it. And this was under Queen Elizabeth. I'd forgotten that.
Yeah.
Drake wasn't involved in it?
Yeah. Well, Drake was batting around too, and in fact, there had been a colony the previous year, prior to the 1587, when these colonists showed up. In 1586, an all-male colony, mostly guys ready to fight, had tried to establish a beachhead there, here in what is now North Carolina, and but they ran into the same difficulty, and their leader went back for resupply. But while he was away getting resupply, and on his way back, he really did try to come back, Sir Francis Drake and his Grand Armada came sailing by and heard these guys were there, stopped in. They told him that they were in trouble, so Francis Drake just picked them all up and took them away. Except they accidentally left 3 guys behind.
My God.
So those 3 guys appear in my book.
What a great novel. It's Shakespearean.
Truly.
It really is.
Yeah, and especially when I concluded that this guy, John Smith, after I read his original account, it didn't ring true to me. It read like a cover-up. I thought, this guy's covering something up. He got this parchment, this document, which was signed by every one of the adults of those 117 people, begging him to go back to England to get resupply. So, and that document survived for a long time till the Great Fire of London, and it was re-recorded. That's how we know the names of all of the 117 colonists. We know whether they were children, we know whether they were married, whether they were single, we know their relationships. We know a lot about them just because of this document that he took back with him. I said to myself, well, why does the leader of this colony, when all of his people are starving to death and in danger from the natives, why does he need a signed document begging him to go back? I said, there's another story there.
That is strange.
Right, so I decided it was blackmail. And the book describes how that came about. So John White, in my book, is not the hero or the sad figure that history has portrayed him to be. He's my villain.
Well, now, this book is out now.
It is, it came out May 2nd.
Wow.
So it's fresh out from
Who's publishing?
Pegasus Books in New York. Excellent publisher.
Yeah.
Really happy with it. My protagonist is a 25-year-old female. So I wrote in the first person in the voice of a 25-year-old female. That was quite a challenge.
Perfect.
It's exactly the right character to write this story.
Absolutely.
That's why I picked her. I've got daughters and granddaughters, and I know the voice. I haven't lived inside the body, but I think I did a pretty good job. They bought the book, and then they assigned a 23-year-old female editor, Katie McGuire, to be my editor.
23-year-old female editor.
Yeah, so now my main character is a 25-year-old 16th century female, and my editor is a 23-year-old 21st century female.
How did
I
that
was
work out?
perfectly. It was fabulous. I mean, you know, she steered me back toward her center line, and when I strayed a little bit far away, everything she suggested, and it was just fine-tuned tweaks, was excellent. She made it a better book. So,
I've never heard of a 23-year-old editor.
This-
They don't have enough life experience
Uh,
to do what great editors are known to do with this. So that's amazing.
Well, I like to trick myself into thinking it's because I've been a long-time editor that I didn't need editing, whether that's true or not. But it was her first book as an editor. She was an editorial assistant prior to this. And Claiborne Hancock, the publisher of Pegasus, told her, okay, go for it. And it really worked out well.
That's wonderful. What a wonderful story.
Yeah, we'll see how it comes.
Well, we're looking forward to you tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
You know, we are. Matter of fact, I'm going to film the whole thing.
Oh, good. Well, I have a
Put this
PowerPoint.
in it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I decided early on, and this is my first author appearance in this book.
Is it?
It's the first one. I have another one Saturday and another one next week, and then I'm going to do some radio things with NPR. But I decided I didn't really want it to be a reading per se. For one thing, you don't want to hear me try to mimic a 25-year-old 16th century English colonist. That's just female. It's not going to work. So, but you can't not. So what I decided to do instead was just talk about the history, how I found it,
Sure.
how I discovered this story, and then how it came about. And
Much, much, much better. But
Yeah.
I assume there's going to be a tape of this, a book to tape, right?
they haven't done that yet. The way,
Because that's tricky.
and who will read that? I know.
Who will read?
Well, it's 100% first person, so
You have a choice?
no, I don't. I have some good friends who are actresses, but I'm not going to try to do that. The way Pegasus publishes, they come out simultaneously in hardcover and ebook, right on the publication date, and then wait 8 months to a year to do the trade paperback, and then the audio book if and when it looks like a good idea. As far as I know, I don't think we have a date yet for the audio book.
Wow. I'm gonna get that for my wife who loves it. That's all she does.
Yeah.
Driving.
Yeah, it's fun. It's not that long. It's 250 pages. You know, it's not. It's a novel. It's not a novella, but it's good.
Now, I assume you have an agent.
Yes, I have a wonderful agent. who has actually been my agent and my wife agents for quite a long time. Her name is Jennifer Unter. She has her own agency called the Unter Agency. She's worked for others. She's actually an attorney. So she's yeah, she's terrific. And so
Has she talked to Hollywood yet? She has to.
yes. Yeah, she does have good contacts out in Hollywood. So and it's Hollywood is an interesting problem. I know a bit about it because I've been publishing modified screenplays.
When I say Hollywood, that's really almost a generic term because the best stuff made now
Is television.
on cable.
Absolutely.
I mean, the series, the HBO, the thing on Johnson,
Right.
Outlander, all those things are phenomenal.
Oh no, true. I mean, we're hooked on Game of Thrones. You know, we really, you know,
Well,
that's terrific. And
Those are the people.
yeah, oh yeah. But but generically Hollywood works. It's the same agencies. It's the same people in the same building. It's the same talent. They're just doing serial stuff on cable instead of feature-length films. You know, most of which are just designed to play big in countries that don't speak English. So consequently, the dialogue is less important than it is in something that runs for 12 weeks on HBO.
Oh God, what a lovely film this would be.
Yeah,
You know who'd be a great voice for you? Kate Blanchett.
well, that would be phenomenal.
I mean,
Yes,
she
absolutely.
could be the voice of this young girl.
Yeah.
She's great. Anyway,
Yeah.
just a thought.
Yeah, well, it's, you know, I mean, a 25-year-old female back in those days was no longer a young girl.
No.
People lived to their 30s. They started having children at age 15. In my case, my Emme Merrimoth is her name. She was thrice widowed and had 3 stillborn, or 1 stillborn and 2 lost later to fevers. So she didn't have any living children. So she came over there as a domestic servant to one of the married couples who were going to have a baby when they got there. And so she came along as a domestic servant and as their future nursemaid.
And she's 25.
25,
My God.
yeah.
Well,
And then,
Well, I'm going to conclude this because I'm going to incorporate this into what you do tonight.
okay, that's great,
And
thank
it'll
you.
be